Well, thank you everybody for joining us for this very special panel that Florida Internet and Television is putting on. We're going to get right down to it as the representative is able to join us, but her time, like everybody else's, is very tight. But before I begin, a couple key facts that Florida Internet and Television always wants everybody to know. In Florida, the industry has invested over $10 billion over the past decade. And what that has resulted is one of the most connected states in the nation. And what that means in reality is that over 95% of Florida's citizens have access to high-speed broadband. The challenge, obviously, for many states, and Florida is not alone in this, is how do we encourage policy or bring policy to our state that will encourage more private sector investment to reach that last 5%. We have an amazing panel. Let me run through them. We have former Commissioner Michael O'Reilly of the FCC joining us. We also have Grover Norquist, with Americans for Tax Reform. We have Zach Cikanek, Executive Director of Connect the Future. Sal Nuzzo, Vice President of Public Policy for the James Madison Institute, and of course, our favorite representative, Representative Josie Tomkow. Grover, you are lauded for the advocacy that you do for lowering taxes at the federal and at the state level. Thank you for joining us. Grover, would you share with our guests a little bit about things that states can do to create a freer and a lower tax environment? Talk to us, give us your perspective on what Florida is doing and what we should be doing.
Sure. Well, it is true that cutting taxes solves all problems, including poison ivy. But what's interesting is that is particularly the case in getting broadband out towards 100% of the population. And one of the challenges Florida has, and a number of other states, is that they apply sales taxes to some of the component parts of building out broadband. And if one were to eliminate the sales tax on, usually don't try and have sales taxes on things that are going to be turned into something else. You want sales taxes for the final product. And this would significantly reduce the cost of getting broadband out. If you make something less expensive, it's easier to do more of it, and it's easier for people to be able to afford it. And so a number of states, I think 13 states do this already, and the goal is to get Florida to do it. There's legislation to that effect. And there are two ways this saves money. One, it's a tax cut. So it reduces the cost of your broadband. But if you don't do that and you don't get the private sector to build out, there are these characters, like the character in The Music Man, Harold Hill, who comes around and says, you should do a government-owned network. And they do a song and dance and tell you how fun it is, and you can have your own government-owned network and be the coolest kid on the block, and because it's the government, we can do it for absolutely everybody regardless of price. And that, having made the sale, and the local government borrows a lot of money, as they did in Provo, Utah, as they did in Chattanooga, as they did in all of Kentucky, the Music Man dances off and leaves you with a debt and an unbuilt system. So the savings are twofold. One, you reduce the sales tax and you get more broadband. And two, you don't get talked into having the government do this, which the government is not very good at many things. One of them is building broadband out or running the post office or any number of things that they like to pretend to do from time to time. So that, I think, is step one. The other one that perhaps Michael talked more about is the private sector can be told by the FCC that if they have a pole and you need to attach attachments to it so that you can everything can talk to each other, all the various signals, there's a price that they've worked out, and if you have the pole owned by one company, the other companies can also use the same pole. Cities often don't have that relationship with the FCC, and they can hold out and say, no, we want lots of money. They were particularly bad about this early on in Utah. One, because they think it's free money, and you have to build it out anyway, so you have to use our pole, so we're going to get rich. But the second part is maybe you'll make it so expensive you won't be able to do it, and then we can do the government-owned network, and that would be fun because we'd be the first city to ever do it successfully. So I think those are two of the big ways you can drop costs. But the best way to stop government-owned networks is to build out private sector networks and to have 3 or 4 horror stories of other cities that have crashed and burned to share with people, and particularly the press when they've been given the song and dance by the Music Man as to how wonderful this is going to be with 76 trombones. So this is very important to help move Florida forward and other states as well, getting rid of the sales tax on the component parts and coming up with a reasonable price that the FCC already does for the private sector and apply that to local governments and the polls that they have that you can attach things to.
Thank you, Grover. Always, you tell a great story when it comes to taxes, and you definitely tell it like no other. So thank you. All right, we're going to go back to Commissioner O'Reilly. Let's take it to the top of the order and talk to us about where you saw the internet when you first started at the commission, where it is today, and where are we going? Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me and living through my technical difficulties. I'll take all the blame on my front. Your team did a wonderful job in setting us all up. And thank you for setting up this informative event. I was testifying this morning at Senate Commerce Committee talking about these very issues. How do we improve broadband expansion into rural America beyond where it is today? How do we address the issues that Grover talked so eloquently about? How do we deal with other issues that are pertinent and a number of different ideas, creative solutions that many legislators have? And I thought I'd talk a little bit about, and Brad set the stage very well, and hopefully I can follow up with that, to talk about, where we've been and where we're going. When I first got to the commission, the speeds were, of the internet were much slower. It was a fight to how can we get everyone to 4.1? And then a little bit it became about speeds of 10.1. That's 10 megabits down and 1 megabit up. And then it came to 25.3. And now the conversation is, where do we go from here and what does it look like? But let me take a step back and talk about what are the benefits of broadband? What are we talking about? Why are we bothering with all of this activity? And the simple fact is that we knew this before the pandemic, but certainly the pandemic has highlighted all of the things that the internet and broadband can do for current Americans and the benefits it brings because of that. So it's not just communicating with loved ones, which is critically important when we're isolated in quarantine, but it's conducting work. It's our education. It's conducting commerce. It's getting groceries. It's surviving in a very difficult situation. And those things have become second nature to us. Everyone talks about ordering Uber Eats or something to that nature. And that sounds simplistic, but it become, in the pandemic time, has been really, really important. And the question is, how do we take that technology, which so many people are benefiting from today, and make sure that everyone has it? Today, the numbers are somewhere between, 14 to 20 million Americans do not have broadband as we would define it. And the question is, how do you fix it? What do you do? What does it look like? What does the new network look like? What can we take advantage of? And it's not just one solution. We're talking about going to be many solutions that are taking advantages. Not one technology. It's going to be a wired, wireless, satellite, all combined with a Wi-Fi within the house to bring people online. But it's heavy lifting. Let's not kid ourselves. This is heavy lifting to make sure that we can address that population that needs access. And that's separate from the discussion that's occurring on affordability or adoption. How do we extend the broadband networks? And what are those barriers to getting broader networks that Grover talks so well about? And I want to outline a couple principles I think are so key. I talk about tech neutrality, and I referenced different technologies that can be used for broadband. It's key that we not try and focus on one thing, that this can only be the solution. It has to be fiber to the home. Because the truth of the matter is the family doesn't care what it looks like, as long as it works. And I've had a number of people point out that we love the new satellite service, the Starlink from Elon Musk. We drop it in the backyard, we hook it up in 2 minutes, and we're operational. They don't care what it looks like. They just want it to work. And so that becomes part of my old job, my old obligations, and my old responsibility. That's what's key, is focusing on what really meets the needs of Americans. Two, it's going to have to be done in a less regulatory form. And that, there's lots of different ways to go about that. I would disagree with those who want to impose like net neutrality. I would certainly argue for reforming of the communications laws that exist today to provide more regulatory certainty and reduce burdens on providers. And three, it means removing all the obstacles to deployment that exist today. What are those obstacles? And rightfully, Grover talked about a couple of them. Certainly one is pole attachments, the conduits, and the ducts. And there's two parts to that. One is the cost of connecting to someone else's network, whether it be the state, local, or municipal provider or some other entity or the private sector. They're all owned by it's a multiple hodgepodge depending on where you are, of who owns what, and it can change by street or by community. So it's very hard to work through that maze to find the right provider and figure out how. And then the question is, well, what am I asked to pay? And the rates are outrageous, depending on the provider and what they're seeking. We've seen rates, 2 to 3 times more than what the FCC has said this is reasonable. 2 to 3 times. We've also seen them as high as 10 to 16 times as much as what the FCC thinks is reasonable in this space. The second part that I mentioned is what do you do with the cost of replacement? A lot of these poles are incredibly old, and we need to move on. Well, then who pays for that? Well, the industry that already exists is saying the new guy gets to pay for the entire new pole. Outrageous presumption, but they have you over a little bit of a barrel. They have the industry in an awkward spot. How do we solve that problem? How do we move forward? And that's some of the responsibility of my old role at the FCC. How do we fix the infrastructure roles? How do we provide some guidance and clarity, and then preempt when necessary for those that are causing heartburn or problematic situation for getting that broadband that I talked about. And the second bigger issue is how do we prevent subsidized overbuilding? How do we keep the private sector how do we keep them the engine that they bring and the benefits it brings to rural America and all the things that we expect from broadband? How do we keep that going if you have multiple federal programs or state programs that are subsidizing someone else to come in and bring service and compete directly with you at a reduced rate, and it's oftentimes with advantages? So Brad also asked me to talk about where are we going? What's the future? And what I would argue to everyone, and I'll take just 2 more minutes, is that there is great federal and state interest and engagement right now in terms of coordination and oversight. If there once was, we're going to let the complete private sector do what it wants to, or we're going to let this problems percolate, or we really like some of the issues that are, we don't want to touch or offend the state and local governments or the municipal network that's operating, or some of the private energy companies that are operating. We don't want to deal with it. That has changed. The mindset has changed. I got an earful this morning of how can we go about and fixing those situations. And I was welcome to the debate. Thank you for people standing up and saying that things need to change. Second, I would say the private sector will continue to lead. The benefits of broadband will continue to have to be, and Grover talked about this, it's going to have to be from the private sector. There is not enough money, and there is not enough will, and there is not enough ability to have a complete takeover of our federal broadband networks that exist today. The efficiencies that come from the private sector cannot be duplicated. We see the failures from those efforts that have tried to build municipal networks. Broadband is different than energy. It's different than water. It's not a monopoly, and it can't be replicated by local government in an efficient way. And so the private sector will have to lead, and it's those partnerships and the programs that the government is building to subsidize those consumers who are I talked about early on, who are not connected. How can we best go forward with them? And then it is complementing those areas and communities and states and local government who've done the right thing. And Florida has been very aggressive in this front, and they've seen what the FCC has done, and they've matched what the activities that we did in the last couple of years. And they said, you've done some really good work here, and you want the broadband benefits, you want the providers to succeed, and you want the private sector to champion and build out its network to those Floridians that need help. And so I'm so proud of the work that Florida has done, and its legislature and the team that has really moved forward. And compliments to Brad and his team and Florida Internet and Television Association for the work that they have done, because they've really moved the ball forward. And if you're rating where things are, Florida's near the top of progress in terms of removing the barriers, addressing the issues that I talked about. And it's really been productive. And I can't thank you enough for setting the stage, and happy to get to the question part when we get there.
Thank you, Commissioner. I really appreciate your thoughts. Yeah, we're going to talk about political courage here with our last speaker, but before we get to her, we're going to go to Zach Cikanek with Connect the Future. Zach, tell us what you guys are seeing, hearing, and advocating for.
Thanks so much. Testing, making sure folks can hear me okay? All right. I was listening to the previous speakers, and I can't help but think how far we've come over the past, 5, 10, 15 years. The internet has changed, the telecommunications landscape has changed, and it's to Florida's credit that they've stayed in the lead on so many of those fronts. It's one of the top 5 states for broadband availability. But on the flip side of that coin, there are still over 800,000 Floridians who don't have access to what the FCC would define as broadband quality internet speeds. And that is a tremendous loss because it means they don't have the same opportunities for distance learning and telemedicine, small businesses, and economic development across the board, and even agriculture. Imagine trying to take advantage of soil sensors and remote drones to compete in the global economy. It's just that much more difficult. And so we have pockets in nearly every county. Actually, the FCC's new program for RDOF invested a tranche of resources to help close the digital divide in the next few years and turbocharge some of those efforts that these companies are making in the states. And they identified communities in 54 out of 67 Florida counties where there are still pockets of unserved households that needed to get online. Connect the Future is working to kind of elevate the conversation around the real nuts and bolts barriers that are making it more difficult to attract investment and more difficult to get that infrastructure from concept to reality as quickly as possible, so that we can stop letting our students and our patients and our businesses miss out on those opportunities. And we are privileged to have among our supporters in the coalition some really outstanding folks at the national level: the National Rural Education Association, the Rural Health Association, the National Grange, and then we also have some outstanding champions here in Florida who are part of the group, the Daytona Regional Chamber of Commerce, the Manatee Education Foundation. If you're interested more, check out fl.connectthefuture.com. But as we work through these issues in these communities, one of the barriers that has really jumped out over and over again is how difficult it can be to put that new infrastructure in place in rural communities that are heavily served by wooden utility poles. They are the backbone of our telecommunications infrastructure, and nowhere more so than in rural communities where you might have to connect one household over 10 poles versus connecting 10 households to a single pole. And so every little bit harder it is to get on that pole, and every dollar extra it costs just gets compounded every further step out you get from wherever your hub is. And so to cover those last few miles and reach those pockets of communities and across the entire state, we're going to have to, streamline those regulatory barriers and make sure that the resources being made available by federal entities, by the state, by local entities, and by the private sector all are as successful as possible, and make those dollars go as far as possible, and make sure that Florida continues to attract new investment until we've completely closed the digital divide. And we're lucky to have some outstanding champions, including the representative on with us today. Thank you so much for being here, who have introduced legislation to really go after these issues and finally get them out of the way so we can get that infrastructure installed. And our mission right now is really to get out there and help educate folks on why these issues are important and how they can make their voice heard to make a difference in Florida and across rural communities coast to coast.
Thank you, Zach. Appreciate the work that you're doing. Well, our next to last speaker is going to be Sal Nuzzo. The James Madison Institute is widely known in Florida as the freedom and small government, independent responsibility organization. Sal, thanks for joining us. Talk to us about where James Madison approaches this conversation, and what are y'all doing in this space?
Absolutely, and thank you very much. You can hear me okay? Okay, great. So JMI's reasoning in our approach to broadband deployment is like that of any other kind of issue that we tackle, that a concentration on free market capitalism, a commitment to limited government and to personal liberty is going to win the day over anything else that might come to pass from a policy standpoint. Mike and Grover and Zach really eloquently and colorfully put out kind of the reasoning behind a lot of why this issue is so important. So really for just a couple of minutes, wanted to tee up a kind of a very nerdy policy paper that JMI is going to be releasing next week that I can give you just a kind of a sneak preview of. And so we articulate 5 specific principles for policymakers and those advocating behind how you can approach this in a way that's going to be the most efficient and effective mechanism for public policy. So first off is, of course, freedom. And as all of the speakers have alluded to, the idea that kind of personal and individual freedom is at the forefront is kind of the linchpin and the cornerstone for all of this. Secondly, and I think it was Zach, or maybe it was Mike, had alluded to the idea of technological neutrality, the idea that cable, fiber, wireless, satellite shouldn't necessarily, there shouldn't be one preferred mechanism, but the approach should be neutral across the board. Third is the idea or the concept that substitute products and services are in fact competition, and they're not always thought of that in the space in the particular ways that they can be. Fourth is legislate, don't regulate, and this is maybe to Rep. Tomkow's to her specifically, but people elected representatives to represent them and pass public policy. Regulators are often remote, they're harder to access, they're harder still to influence. And so to the degree that the policy can be legislated as opposed to regulated is going to be better. And lastly, consumers should ultimately be put in charge. Consumer choice and the idea of free market competition is ultimately going to bridge that final gap. So what can Florida policymakers do now? Well, pretty much everything that folks have articulated already. The idea of fixing the issue around pole attachments is going to be paramount. And it's great to see Rep. Tomkow and Senator Burgess on the Senate side proposing great legislation with respect to that. In addition, avoiding government-owned networks at all cost. I love the way Grover had put it. In just about every instance that they've been tried, they've been just boondoggles and radical failures. And lastly is the tax approach. We would agree, a sales tax exemption or some kind of a way that the tax can be more equitable and avoided or in some way, shape, or form via policy is going to ultimately make its way to the consumer. And so those are the things that we're working on, and it'll be a pleasure to kind of distribute the report next week when it gets out of layout, and I really look forward to continuing to engage in the issue.
Thank you, Sal. I'm sure you're going to have a partner in Florida Internet Television helping you get the word out on that paper. Thank you. All right, last but certainly not least, Representative Tomkow, you and Senator Burgess are running some amazing legislation this year. You eloquently wrote in your op-ed about how you represent constituents who are both connected and unconnected. You have a really varied district, and you even talked about some of your own challenges during COVID. So share with our viewers a little bit about, or a lot about, frankly, why you were advancing this legislation and what brought you to that decision that you were going to do this.
Absolutely. Well, thank you guys for having me on this panel. And it's just so interesting to hear everyone's thoughts on this issue, because I know it's an important one. And I just want to point out, I am personally one of the 800,000 Floridians without connectivity. My family and we live in a very rural area. I live on our ranch. And so you can imagine when COVID hit and we were having to take constituent calls, Zooms, you name it. It was really hard in order for me to be able to connect with my constituent base who I was trying to serve during this hard time. When it comes to what brought out this legislation, it goes just straight to my constituents. It was the fact that kids were having to learn from home. telehealth being a huge component to this pandemic. And also me being in agriculture, that is my background, that is my livelihood. Not being able to, when we have to send videos of our cattle to our salesperson over in Texas, not being able to send that video when we're out in the pasture is a problem, and it slows down business. I am very fortunate that I have a great partner in Senator Burgess and all of you as we talk about these issues and really important issues. I just want to point out it's not a blanketed approach, as we all have said. You know, there's many ways that we can tackle this issue. And as you see in the Florida House, a lot of people have thrown out different ideas of how we accomplish that goal. I think that when we start having these conversations is truly when we can resolve these issues. And I just want to point out, you know, one thing, as we have put this legislation forward, everyone who has a key role in accomplishing this goal of broadband for these Floridians has come to the table and has had a willingness to really have really important and tough conversations as to how we combat, you know, whether it be the full attachment rates, whether it be, you know, the make ready costs. They have been willing to have those hard conversations. And so I think that first off, that is a huge thing that Florida has going for them, is people are willing to have those conversations. Many companies in my district specifically aren't returning to the workspace. We have major companies in our area, and they're saying that they don't foresee that they will have their employees come back. And so it's a huge issue of how are we going to help those individuals be successful? How are we going to help our children, you know, do their schoolwork and elevate them to be on a successful level to compete with those who have you know, tremendous access to broadband. And so with our legislation, I know it's, you know, in its beginning stages, and we should be up in committee hopefully sometime soon to where we can really have those thoughtful conversations with members. I know I'm not the only member that deals with this issue. There are other members that have come to me and they're like, I'm so glad you're bringing this about because I live in this city, and guess what? In my city, we have blackout sites to where people don't have access to this internet service. And so as we move forward, I just hope that we can allow for these really important conversations to continue on, because this is, in my opinion, very important legislation to push forward. And I think that the pandemic has definitely highlighted the issues, but the issues have always been there. It has always been an issue, you know, for me and my family. It's always been an issue for even my legislative aide. It's so funny, we always laugh that we're trying to submit the bill for broadband and we can't submit it because one of our jetpacks had failed. And so that is an issue. And so I just hope that I can bring something home to not only my constituents, but other constituents in the state of Florida that are dealing with this issue. And hopefully we can come to the 21st century and have people that they can go on Facebook, they can call their doctor, and, you know, much more services that the internet offers. And so I appreciate all of the thoughtful discussion today. And as I move forward with my legislation, I know I will be hearing from many of you, and Brad in particular. We've talked very heavily on this. And so I just appreciate everyone's support and willingness to really step up to the plate and help Floridians out.
Well, Representative, we can't thank you enough for convening the industry and really taking everyone's input to advance legislation that works for everybody. So thank you for your leadership there. Okay, we're actually over our time, but we're going to do kind of a speed round here, and we'll go back to the top of the original order, and we'll start with Commissioner O'Reilly in 20 seconds or less. Kind of give us your number one, you know, directive for the Florida legislature and Florida in general.
Well, look, I want to thank the Florida legislature for taking this up. And Representative, thank you for all you're doing, especially in facing the circumstance that you are. So I would push forward as fast as I can. If I could be any help on that cause, I want to be there for you. It's going to take a lot of effort, and there are powerful forces to deal with things like the pole attachment rates and the replacement rates. So that's going to be one of the key issues certainly going forward.
Thank you, Commissioner. Grover, you're up.
Get rid of the sales tax on the component parts of broadband. Fix that question about how you price attachments to poles, and don't let them talk you into a government-owned network.
Getting rid of the music men. Got it.
Yep.
All right, Zach, you're up. Zach.
Oh, sorry, I thought I heard you say. COVID-19 has supercharged attention on the digital divide, but we're going to be right back here next time around if we don't take the actions we need to take immediately to finally close the digital divide. And we're lucky to have members at the state and federal level who are working to do that. So lift up your voices, let your lawmakers know that you support their efforts. They need to hear from us. And that's the only way we're going to make this a priority and move quickly enough to ensure that next year and the year after that, we're going to start to really see the very last of those communities and those households and those businesses and those farms finally brought into the internet ecosystem so that they can have the same opportunities that we take for granted elsewhere.
Thanks, Zach. Sal?
Supercharge free market competitors and get government out of the way as much as possible, and it'll all come out okay.
Thank you, Sal. And Representative Tomkow, final words.
I would just say, to repeat some of the things that have been said here, I am government, but I would say that when government can get out of the way and let the private sector do its job is a really good day. And so I just appreciate, once again, the thoughtful discussions around this topic. And I think that there, like I said, is a lot of opinions on how we can achieve this goal. And if there's anything that I'm not seeing or anything that maybe has not been brought to our attention, please bring it to my attention.
Thank you, Representative. It's amazing how when a business person gets elected to office, they bring those same mindsets to policy that you advance. Thank you for everything you're doing. Thanks to all the panelists for joining us. We know the conversation is just the beginning, and we will continue to fight for the best environment for broadband connectivity. And on behalf of the 133,000 Floridians who work to make internet connectivity possible in the state of Florida, we thank all the attendees for tuning in to this Florida Internet and Television panel. Thank you.